Isabella Taborowski is a Senior Program Associate at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and a Research Fellow at the London Center for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. This talk was recorded just weeks before the Russian propaganda machine, drawing on 120 years of expertise, launched its latest campaign. Today, it is telling the world that Ukraine is not a real nation or an authentic state, that Ukrainians are Nazis, and that Ukraine is nothing but a tool of imperialism that must be dismantled by an invading army. In this talk, Taborowski shows how the anti-Zionist ideology that was cooked up in Moscow in the 1960s labelled Israel as not real or authentic, as apartheid and fascist, and as a tool of imperialism that must be dismantled by invading armies. She looks at the relevance of that Soviet propaganda to today's left and liberal focus on the unique evils of Israel.
All right, so many of the ideas that we discussed today, so many of the anti-Zionist ideas that contemporary left uses are exactly the same as what used to exist in the Soviet Union, which is where I grew up. And of course, the USSR used to target the West in the developing world with this anti-Zionist propaganda in multiple ways. And there are definite and multiple links. And so it's very much worth looking at this background to understand some of what I believe does go into contemporary left anti-Semitism. Now, I use 1967 as my starting point in my talk and generally in my research. It's not where Soviet anti-Zionism begins, but this is the period from 1967 to the end of the USSR where it becomes particularly intense. And this is where it acquires a massive international dimension. And it's also a period when some of the ideas that we're still dealing with today, in fact, coalesce into their present form. Now, Soviet anti-Zionism has been described to an extent in the literature that describes Soviet anti-Semitism. And as part of that literature, it is often explained from the position of, well, the Soviet regime was inherently anti-Semitic, and so it invented all of these anti-Zionist slogans in order to oppress the Jews. And I actually think that it was more complicated than that, because the Soviet anti-Zionist campaign that began in 1967 was really an integral part of the Soviet Cold War effort. And it's important to understand it. It was developed to support Soviet foreign and domestic policy objectives to begin with. So what were these objectives? Obviously, there were foreign policy goals in the Middle East, right? An air naval presence in the Mediterranean, counterbalance to the NATO presence there, access to Arab oil, a desire to use the Middle East and the Suez Canal as a link between Soviet forces in the Med and the Indian Ocean, utilize the Middle East as a bridgehead for Soviet penetration to Africa. So these kinds of foreign policy goals that probably actually existed even during the Russian Empire period with some variations. And in fact, some of them in some variation exist today. But what got added in the 1950s was that the USSR wanted to establish progressive regimes in the region, progressive quote unquote, this is Soviet lingo. They saw it as a precondition for achieving their other foreign policy goals as a way to increase their sphere of influence in the Middle East and kind of change the global balance of power. And at that point, in fact, the Arab countries were ripe for Soviet penetration, and through a series of events, which I'm not going to go through here, the Soviet Union does become first sort of the patron and guardian of Egypt, and then subsequently of other countries. And so Arab public opinion begins to see the USSR as really the only power friendly to the Arab cause, not in the least because the USSR takes the pro-Arab position in the Israel-Arab conflict. So there is military, economic, diplomatic aid, right, that kind of relationship going on. And then comes the Six-Day War, and it puts all of it on its head. And Israel's victory threatens all of these Soviet objectives and achievements in the region. And there's also, and the question arises, one of the questions that arises is how do we, first of all, how did Israel manage to win such a small country versus such a powerful enemy? And how do we counteract it? And one of the answers that the Soviets arrive at, which is quite a natural conclusion, I think, for them, is that there is a powerful ideology that is acting behind them, behind the scenes against them. This ideology is Zionism, and it has a global character, and they now need to fight it, right? They need to fight it, including in the propaganda sphere. And propaganda sphere, of course, was always very strong, one of the strongest kind of sides for the Soviets. Now, on the domestic front, there are things that are brewing as well. So 67, Israel's victory produces, it's a huge inspiration for Soviet Jews. It's a transformative moment for them. It awakens their national consciousness. The Jewish national movement inside the USSR begins to grow. Soviet Jews now they understand that being Jewish also can be a source of pride, not just a source of shame. And they want to know what it means. What does it mean to be Jewish? They don't know. By 67, Soviet Jews no longer know what it means to be Jewish. And so they start studying Hebrew, they start learning about Israel. And all of a sudden, the Soviets have a dissident underground Jewish movement on their hands. This movement is different from a movement that also was happening at the time, the democratic dissident movement. The Jewish movement doesn't want to reform or democratize the Soviet Union. The Jewish movement, which is basically a Zionist movement, really, says, look, we are not against the Soviet power. You, Soviet Union, continue on your path. We wish you 500 more years of Soviet power, to the Soviet people. In fact, they say so in the trials, when there are anti-Zionist trials happening, they say this, they voice this out loud. They just say, look, we're just Jews. We want to be in the country where we can continue to be Jews. And that country is Israel. And so this is happening at home. The Soviet Jewry movement is happening outside the country, right? So, and that movement calls the Soviet Union anti-Semitic, and you have Meir Kahane and the Jewish Defense League disrupting Soviet artists' performances. You have Golda Meir calling for Soviet Jews to emigrate. And the Soviets are getting very triggered, to use a contemporary word, right? They really care about their image. They hated that they're called anti-Semitic. And then Congress passes the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, and that's a massive blow for them economically. And more than anything, they just can't understand why America would care so much about Jews as to insert an entire piece of legislation that impacts their relations with the other superpower, right? Economic relations, military. I mean, really, the entire world peace is at stake, and all Americans cares about the Jews. And so that just feeds their paranoia and their belief that, in fact, Jews control everything. Zionist Jews control everything, right? And Zionist Jews own everything and everyone. And so that sort of builds on itself. So this is kind of, I think that's important to understand this propaganda that develops at the time in this context, because it has a utilitarian purpose. It has a policy purpose. But of course, as it develops, it begins to impact the Jews of the Soviet Union in a completely anti-Semitic way, even though the Soviets are very, very careful to ensure that anything they say comes across as strictly, uses only anti-Zionist words, right? Only anti-Zionist terms. So what were some of the ideas that they put out? So first of all, kind of as a general look, right? This campaign lasted about 20 years, from 67 through the end of the Soviet Union. Hundreds of books were published, thousands of articles castigating Zionism and Israel, books published in hundreds of thousands of copies, translated into dozens of languages, sent abroad, kind of books turned into brochures, little brochures that could be easily distributed. Articles published in newspapers that had circulations of tens of millions and republished abroad, again, in dozens of languages. So all of them containing basically ideas that could be traced back to just one book. And that book is called Caution Zionism by Yuri Ivanov. So who is Yuri Ivanov? It's important to understand this because it helps us to understand what was the source of these ideas and who was the sponsor of these ideas. So Ivanov was an employee of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He reported to a Central Committee functionary in the International Department of the Central Committee. His name was Ivan Milovanov, who served as the deputy of the Middle Eastern section. It's a mouthful, it doesn't matter. The point is that here's a Central Committee functionary who collects around him, gathers around him, a group that came to be known as Milovanov's anti-Zionist circle. And it's about a dozen or so of people who come to be known as sort of Zionologists. And their task is to formulate anti-Zionist thesis that the Central Committee's Propaganda and Agitation Department, and probably the KGB as well, could use to counteract all of these foreign and domestic threats, which they view as emanating from international Zionism. So within the Central Committee, characteristically, Ivanov was kind of referred to caustically as the main Zhidologist of the Soviet Union. And everybody probably knows the word Zhid, which means kike. So this is his, this is what he's called. So, so this is now as a little kind of, just to return back to what I said at the beginning, when I said that it would be wrong to attribute Soviet anti-Zionism purely to an inherent anti-Semitism of the regime. Now, that is true, but what's also true is that by the 1960s, what you see developing the Soviet Union as an important and pretty widespread far-right Russian nationalist movement, which is deeply anti-Semitic, and it acquires very serious influence in the ruling circles. And Milovanov was certainly part of that movement, was deeply influenced by its thinking. And Milovanov's Zionologists were the intellectuals who were part of that movement. They drew their knowledge about Jews from the pre-revolutionary Black Hundreds literature. Some of them were known Nazi admirers and drew their ideas from Nazi literature. And their task was to apply their knowledge about the Jews, which they derived from that literature, and to express it in anti-Zionist terms. Okay, so here comes the book Koshin Zionism. So Koshin Zionism offers a Marxist-Leninist critique of Zionism. It's a wholesale condemnation, demonization of Zionism, but it's written in the pseudoscientific style, which the Soviets really loved, right? Everything had to be scientific. You had scientific, everything in social sciences was scientific, right? So there are multiple footnotes. If you look at the footnotes, which of course nobody would have, but if you're a nerd like myself, you do look at footnotes and you see, first of all, that sources that he quotes were unavailable to anyone in the USSR. They belonged in closed sections of libraries that you had to have special permission to access. So that already tells you, even if you didn't know who he was, but that already tells you that this was something that emanated from special kind of high level, the organs as it was called, right? The special organizations that dealt with propaganda. And then if you look at the footnotes, you also realize how, he quotes multiple foreign sources, but he twists and manipulates the sources. If you look at them, you understand that sometimes the author actually planned to say something completely different from what he's actually saying. So he's communicating several ideas which remain relevant to the current moment, for the current moment. So for one thing is he claims that he attempts to prove the claim, or rather to debunk the Zionist claim, as he calls it, the Jews are a single nation. Why is that important? Because that way you can show that American, Israeli, and Soviet Jews are completely separate kinds of Jews, which means that Soviet Jews have no reason to want to emigrate, which means that the campaign for Soviet Jewry is a sham, because what do our Soviet Jews have to do with these American Jews or these Israeli Jews? They have nothing in common. And so the campaign for Soviet Jewry is simply an anti-Soviet movement, anti-communist, anti-socialist movement. Another idea that he communicates is that Zionists attempt to undermine the workers' struggle by separating Jews into a unique subclass and thus preventing Jewish masses from fighting for the better future. He communicates the Zionists agree with anti-Semites. The Jews do not belong among the peoples of the world. And so that then creates the logical link that Zionism is actually anti-Semitic. It's something that we see today on the left all the time. He goes over the pre-state history of Zionism and notes that Herzl, for example, sought to gain influence with the biggest anti-Semites, such as the Tsarist regime, again, to prove the idea that Zionists work with anti-Semites. He presents proof that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are not the same, also very current, proof, of course, quote unquote. And he lays out for the first time in full color the whole story, quote unquote, of the Zionist collaboration with the Nazis, which we see to this day. And I won't rehearse it here. I think that a lot of people understand or have seen it. It's repeated all the time today, right? It's the story of German Jews, the boycott of Nazi Germany, the transfer agreement, the supposedly favorable way in which Nazis viewed Zionists, Hitler's love of Zionism, the Kastner affair. So the whole notion that Zionists collaborated with the Nazis in the Holocaust and in the destruction of their own people is laid out here with footnotes, with explanations, with argumentation. This is something that you see today rehearsed in the play in Perdition. It's something that Ken Livingstone's reproduced in some way. Most recently, I saw this idea resurfaced in an education video that was put out by AJ Plus. kind of a cool and popular and progressive arm of Al Jazeera. It was viewed by over 1 million people. Paul Bogdanor actually has done an excellent job tracing these ideas back to Lenny Brenner and debunking them. And he was completely correct. And the only thing that I would say is that I think we need to trace them beyond Lenny Brenner. I suspect that Lenny Brenner picked them up somewhere in some Soviet sources, which he may not even know that they were Soviet sources. But you couldn't have two people kind of invent the same narrative in an almost exact same way, right? So there's some Soviet influence there for sure. Okay, so so these ideas are repeated in Soviet propaganda over and over again, including abroad, including in what they send abroad. One thing that I want to say about the Zionologists that were working on these ideas is that they were often placed in prestigious institutes in the Soviet Academy of Sciences. So they had very high purchase from which they could communicate and teach their ideas. A lot of them were in fact Arabists, which is interesting. And if I have time, I'll get to it later. They were in one way or another scholars of the Arab Middle East, which in the USSR really meant that they would take pro-Arab positions. They knew Arabic, they visited the Middle East a lot, they had connections in the Middle East at the highest level, in Syria. Some of their books were regularly published in Syria and in Beirut in Arabic. So that's an important point to keep in mind. So how do we know that all of this was really communicated and coordinated from the center? So we do have some declassified memos from the Central Committee, from the heads of the departments of agitation propaganda, from the International Department. We have a detailed declassified memo in which the Soviet ambassador to the US in the 70s, I think, reports on how it is fighting anti-Zionism in America. The memos are very, very detailed, in which they report on how they if it's instructions, then they kind of give an assignment to place this many articles in foreign press that would communicate the Soviet anti-Zionist position. The American ambassador communicates the success of having placed certain articles. And in fact, you can trace one of there was a New York Times article that they report in the memo having placed, and in fact, it does exist, this article. So there's that. Then in 1973, there was a trial in Paris in which a group of French organizations, Jewish organizations and interfaith organizations sued a French communist who was a figurehead heading a Soviet embassy bulletin. And they sued him for defamation because the bulletin published an extremely anti-Semitic piece. If you look at the piece, it's basically a repetition of some of the ideas from Caution Zionism. But also what you recognize, and it's only come to light today, is that that piece was actually written by one of the Zionologists under a fake name, under a Jewish sounding name. But so you have an example of a French embassy distributing anti-Zionist literature, in fact, with encouraging others to republish it. And so that's kind of another sign, right, that of how it was coordinated centrally. Then you have Mahmoud Abbas's dissertation, which compared or equalized Zionism with Nazism. And of course, there's a whole story of where he defended it in the Soviet Union and was overseen by Soviet Zionologists. So there's a number of points that really kind of demonstrate that this was centrally coordinated. Not as much as we'd like to. Today, the archives are closed, so it's not an easy research to conduct, but it can be done, and I think that the proof is fairly clear. Okay, Soviet propaganda mechanisms, maybe I will skip through that, but I'll just say that what's important to understand is that this kind of propaganda was delivered not only through the press, but also through multiple institutions in which the Soviets had influence. So there were Soviet friendship societies, there were multiple Soviet front organizations, all of which at one point or another participated in the distribution or support of this kind of propaganda. How do we fight these ideas? I think a lot of us have expressed frustration today at our failure to fight these ideas. And I think that one of the things that's important to understand is that what we're dealing with is propaganda. Just that fact alone, I think, is important to understand, because this propaganda was not put together on a logical basis. It was not meant to deal with logically. It was meant to address groups of people based on their emotions and values and motivations. It was meant to kind of hit people at the gut level, at the emotional level. And I think this is part of the difficulty that we have, because we try to address all of this on the logical level and people approach it on an emotional level. And this is kind of the enduring strength of this propaganda. And one last thing I'll say is that I've realized the more I read all of this and the more I research all of this, is that I think that we really, really need to understand Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda in the Arab world. And for that, we need people who can obviously read Arabic, and I unfortunately don't. But actually, one of the Russian scholars, really excellent Russian historians, has written something that caught my attention. He said that, look, I always thought that Soviet propaganda went to the Arab world and influenced the Arab world. What this historian says is that, in fact, this Zionologist circle, in a way, acted as agents of influence for the Arab world, in which they had very high-level connections, right? So they would take some of these ideas, which the Arab leaders they didn't have the reach to communicate them to the world, but these people did. And so they would produce these ideas as part of their campaign of support for the Arab countries with which they were so close. So I think that it would be really, really interesting and important to understand how much of it and what exactly made it into the Arab world. What were the connections there? And the reason I think it's important is I sort of have a theory, which is I want to emphasize, don't quote me on this, it's just a suspicion or a theory that I have, that I think that the missing link here in our struggling with understanding this is quite possibly the Palestinian connection, because the Palestinians were very, very important for the Soviets. They're very, very important for today's left. If in fact so much of Soviet anti-Zionist literature got settled in the Arab world and was so deeply connected to the thinking in the Arab world, then I just wonder if the resurfacing of these ideas in the last 20 years or so may have been thanks to the left's connection with the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian leadership.